Well, greetings from your pastor at the manse here, and it's good to be back from vacation and looking forward to a week from Sunday. That would be June 28th for those of us that are going to gather back at our church for worship at 10 o'clock on that Sunday morning. Of course, this coming Sunday, there will be the video that will be available to you to watch and to participate in. And hopefully you'll maybe invite some neighbors or friends or co-workers to tune in through YouTube and to experience that service and get a sense of who we are at First Presbyterian Church. I plan on also continuing to do these midweek meditations and to share them with you regularly. And I just recently, besides my other readings, I have been concentrating on the book of Acts and also on the life of Paul. Paul is considered kind of the second person in terms of importance to the Christian faith because of all that he wrote and that we have in our New Testament. And Paul, his name was Saul. Saul was his Hebrew name, Jewish fellow. And Paul was basically his Greek name. So at one point in the book of Acts, that history of the earliest history we have of the Christian church, he at one point, without really any fanfare, his name is being used in the writing as Saul, Saul, Saul. And then all of a sudden it mentions, and there was this, and Saul was doing such and such, also known as Paul. And from then on, he's known as Paul. Same person, just now using the lingua franca, I guess you could say, the Greek language, although you have the Roman, the Latin developing, not to get complicated, but in terms of the Hebrew, or in terms of the New Testament being written in Greek, the Koine Greek. So in any event, because of that particular study that I've been concentrating on, at least in terms of biblical studies, I thought over the next few weeks or so, I would share with you some thoughts on the book of Acts and also on Paul. So I'm going to begin by reading a text that I think fits very much for today and also has been used for 2,000 years. It was written by Paul, probably in the mid-first century of the Common Era. Christianity was developing. It was very new. Okay, Paul was a late bloomer, latecomer to the Christian faith. And so we have this letter to the Galatians. He had been there, started a church and all. But he writes to them, and they're having their issues, as all people do, all groups do. But at one point he says to them, and keeping in mind these folks are both Gentile, non-Jew, and Jewish in terms of followers of Christ. And that is a significant distinction of difference back at that time, which the book of Acts deals with continuously, as does Paul in his developing the earliest of churches, the ecclesias, the churches, the fellowships of Christianity. Because in point of fact, it originated within Judaism, Jesus being Jewish. All of his original followers were Jewish. Okay, and then, as you all know, that most Judaism said, no, he's not the Messiah. And they went on and continued to flourish in their own substantial, worthy religion, Judaism. But Christianity went in a different direction, although always wedded to the Hebrew Scriptures, always wedded to that concept of monotheism and the ethical monotheism of that era, of that faith tradition. So anyhow, we get to Galatians here, and he has written to them, and at one point in chapter 3, verses 28 and 29. By the way, back at that time, there was no versification, there were no chapters, headings, and this and that and the other thing. But for us, this helps us to find the Bible text we want to talk about. He says at one point, keeping in mind this idea of the two different groups, and that's been a problem, and it's a problem with the Galatians, what's going on, okay? But that's for another time. Paul declares to them, to this group, there is neither Jew nor Greek. In other words, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, okay? There's neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. Now see, Paul, being Jewish, felt that there was a definite continuity between the former covenant, the covenant of the Jews, of Judaism, with this new developing covenant, contract, understanding with and through Jesus Christ. Okay? Well, that was a major distinction, a difference between Judaism and its remains and Christianity. Okay? But back at this time, this Jewish fellow who has become a Christian, a follower of Christ, is saying, we're all one. So there's a universalization concept here that's taking place. It runs throughout the New Testament, and it also runs throughout Judaism in the sense that, let me go back to Genesis chapter 12, beginning of the first verse, just the first 3 verses there. Listen to this in terms of the continuity of a particularism, because we Christians could look at ourselves today in a sense. We're particularized. This is who we define ourselves as, just as Jews, they define themselves as Islam, Muslims define themselves as, certain type of predicates follow that, okay? Well, but keep in mind there's this great continuity with Christianity and Judaism. There's been a lot of problems and heartache and horror in terms of the history of Christianity and the way we've treated Jews historically and such, but thank God we've come a long way, and we need to continue to do so and to improve. But in any event, way back in Genesis here, okay, in chapter 12, now the Lord said to Abram, turns out that his name turns to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Of course, that's the land of Palestine, or that's the land of Canaan, depending on if the Romans and whoever else were in charge at different parts of history. And I will make of you a great nation, and will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you I will curse. And by you all the families of the earth shall bless themselves. All the families of the earth. On one level, that's better than using the word nation so often that we find in our Bible translations. The nation states came about only in the last couple hundred years, and so we need to be careful when we think about the idea of nation states or of nations when we're reading the Bible. It was all peoples who had a specific identity. It's not just meant for one group. And Judaism has recognized that maybe in different times because of different eras and such, and different problems and issues. But the Hebrew text, the Old Testament, has the idea that the Jewish nation or the Jewish people are going to be a light, are going to be a way to show all of the other nations, all of the other peoples, etna, depending on it's within the Greek language. Goya, actually, that's also is where that comes from. But there's this particularity that we all carry, but there's this universalism that also is present within Christianity, in that now there's no distinction between Jew and Christian, that those who become followers of Jesus, of Christ. Okay, but it's there right in the Hebrew Scriptures, and the Hebrew Scriptures themselves were saying to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews, that here is the way to live, and they treated them with respect as they came into their own areas, into the area of where the Jews were. The Jews had certain requirements of how they are to treat the foreigner with respect according to their laws and such. So the idea here is in the earliest of the beginnings of the book of Acts, that it's going to be a history of what follows after the resurrection and Jesus being taken up to heaven. And we talked about Pentecost already, and how they were gathered in that room, and there was a gathering of the nations around them, hearing about all these different languages, because in point of fact, everyone was to hear about this good news, the good news of Jesus Christ, which was really an understanding of Judaism in terms of how this ethical God expects all people to live. And so we begin in Acts a journey from the particularity of just being Jewish followers to being of all peoples, nations. All peoples began to come in. And that caused quite a stir back at that time, and understandably so. So I hope to, over the next few weeks, give you some prime examples from the book of Acts, this history, which was written certainly with the intent of converting, of getting people to follow this Jesus Christ. But when we get to Paul early on here, because it's really mainly about Paul's mission in Acts, we get there that Paul has been going to the synagogues, but more and more he's finding that his way to share Christ is to go to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews, to the peoples outside of Jerusalem, outside of the Jewish peoples. So that's where we are, and I'll pick up with this next week and share with you. There's a great story in Acts chapter 10 about Peter, one of the apostles, and it's a prelude to what's going to happen in Paul's journey in terms of journeying throughout the Mediterranean world to share the message of Christ to the non-Jews, to those pagans who had such a different way of viewing life and how to live one's life. And Paul is convinced, he is confirmed in his conviction that Christ is the way to follow, that Christ is the way to live one's life, and it is all predicated on the Jewish concepts of this one God, this monotheism, this ethical God that has expectations for us, that we are actually all peoples are to be united in this way of looking at each other, respecting and caring for each other. God bless, and again, I can't wait to see you. Bye-bye.